Is Europe's policy for plain packaging on tobacco working, and really does it have a future? We have with us today Professor Sinclair Davidson from RMIT in Australia to talk about Australia's experience and what the data actually shows. Professor Davidson, thank you for joining us today. Australia has tried this policy of plain packaging on tobacco for a while. What kind of results did it have?
The policy has been somewhat unsuccessful, I have to say. It's been in place for 5 years, coming in the 1st of December 2012. It's now December 2017, and it's actually a good time to have a retrospective and work out what's happened. The bottom line is that there are more smokers in Australia today than what there were 5 years ago when the policy was introduced.
But there are more people in Australia today.
There are more people in Australia, but for the first time in about 30 years, the National Household Drug Survey showed no decline in the prevalence of smoking in the population. Now, this is a 3-year survey, so it's not as fine as we would like, but nonetheless, it flatlined since the introduction of this particular policy.
So, tobacco industry's sales haven't gone down. Nobody else is really smoking statistically. There's not an increase in smoking overall. So what's the problem?
The problem is that it engenders a criminality. So we've had massive increases in crime around this particular area, to the extent that...
For example, what kind of crime?
Theft and robbery of tobacco products, smuggling. We've also had a tobacco industry executive attempted kidnapping outside his home. The other problem is that we are now exporting a failed policy. So that's a particular serious problem.
So you're saying that what Europe's doing today with the packaging and how this is being applied across Europe is failed?
It will almost certainly fail the same way it's failed in Australia.
And what's the evidence so far that we can see?
Well, in Europe it's very early days. It's only been introduced, I think, in France this year, and in Europe late last year, I think, was the introduction. So we haven't seen any data seriously from there. But we have seen, for example, around tax refunds on excise in France, the same sort of pattern as happened in Australia. So if the very, very early evidence out of France is the same as what the very early evidence out of Australia, we would expect the same sort of thing. Because ultimately and fundamentally, Australians and Europeans are not that different in their behaviours.
So really, the argument is nothing's really changing, but is that a problem?
Well, that is a problem, because for the tobacco industry itself, they have been harmed to the extent that smokers are now substituting for what we call cheapies. Now, if you're a firm, a business, you want to sell a premium branded product, a high margin product. What is now happening is smokers are walking into stores and saying, "Give me your cheaper cigarettes." Now, this actually effectively undermines other policies the government have of increasing prices for cigarettes. So in Australia, for example, why would you pay $40 for a premium branded packet of cigarettes when you can pay $13 for a similar product? Because it's now a commodity. It turns out from the medical research that smokers can't tell the difference between their brand of cigarettes and normal cigarettes or any other cigarette in a blind tasting. So they are now substituting, and of course when you substitute for a lower price, very often you will smoke more. Is this really what you want from a particular policy? In terms of quitting behaviours, the government's evidence suggests that the graphic health warnings are actually more effective at causing people to quit smoking than other policies.
Let's come to that in a second, but if the people are switching to cheaper cigarettes, yes, and the tax revenue isn't substantially going down.
No, the tax revenue has gone down.
How much has it gone down by?
This year it was $200 million less than what they were anticipating. Oh, off the top of my head, I'm not sure. But it has actually gone down. Now, when you are buying, and also the criminality has gone up. So when you are buying from a criminal organisation, bear in mind those criminal organisations don't pay company tax, they don't pay payroll tax, they don't obey the law, they engage in violence to resolve disputes not going through the criminal justice system. Their employment conditions don't comply with minimum employment conditions. So
there's a wider social harm.
There is a wider social harm that is more or less unseen. And from an economic perspective, there's the seen, there's the unseen. Encouraging criminality is not a good idea. So we have the government saying to us, for example, don't buy pirated DVDs because the money goes to support terrorism. And yet their own policy is encouraging people to buy pirated cigarettes. They must be encouraging terrorism too, you would imagine.
You work for RMIT.
For a university.
Who else do you work for?
I work for the Institute of Public Affairs. I'm a senior research fellow there. It's an honorary position, they don't pay me money, and I am a academic fellow at the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, which
is
a
libertarian group.
Libertarian group, yes.
Okay,
yes.
and you're paid by the tobacco industry?
No, not at all. The university forbids academics from taking or actually having much association with the tobacco industry at all. So my first research done into plain packaging was commissioned research by a journal editor, an academic journal editor, peer-reviewed from the Australian National University.
From your studies, which policy worked?
There are two things that really work well. The first one is increased public understanding and knowledge of the harms tobacco causes people. Education. And I think we've been doing education certainly in the Western world for 40 years. I don't think anybody can say they don't know that smoking is bad for them. And we do a pretty good job there. And taxation. Now bear in mind there are limits to how much you can tax things before you start getting smuggling and prohibition costs and all these sorts of things. The graphic health warnings is a form of an education policy. And of course there are other things. I mean, I don't think anybody minds so much that minors can't smoke. They can't drink alcohol, they can't vote, they can't drive motor cars. So the protection of children and all these sorts of things, these are all sound policies. But when you get to the extent that you're actually encouraging people to buy from criminals rather than buy from legal organizations, bear in mind when you buy from a legal organization, you know what poisons you're putting into your body. When you buy from a criminal organization,
most people aren't buying cigarettes from criminal organizations. They're buying them still from the street stall. They're buying them from the shop, perhaps even from the supermarket.
Quite possibly, but the amount of people buying from criminals has actually increased. And the amount.
How do you measure that?
The KPMG does a survey every year where they go around and they do packet counts. So you look through rubbish, or you look on the street, and you actually look at the you look at the packets. So a lot of cigarettes have come into Australia from Asia. So these are actually legally purchased tobacco in Asia and then re-exported, smuggled into Australia with no excise being paid on them. And then actually other brands that are directly manufactured by criminals.
Okay, you mentioned earlier about the graphic warnings on packaging. If this policy was working and the plain packaging doesn't seem to have any effect, is the plain packaging actually damaging the process that had commenced with the graphic warnings?
That is my view of the matter. So the graphic warnings in Australia came in 2006, introduced by the former Howard government. And the plain packaging, the olive grey, ugly, taking away the branding, all those sorts of things, those were actually intended to enhance the warning signs. It actually turns out people have stopped looking at the packets because the packets are unattractive. So in the bad old days, you would take out a packet of cigarettes, the person would look at the packet, and people around them would look at the packet, and then they would notice the graphic health warnings. Nowadays, when somebody takes out a packet, people don't even look at the packet because there's no point. You're not going to see a brand name. Okay,
so government should really just look at the facts, look at the statistics, and say this isn't working, we should go back to what we were doing before.
Yes, I very seriously doubt that any of the governments that have introduced plain packaging are ever going to repeal it. But certainly I would think other governments should be looking very carefully at the data. It is publicly available. Put a team of statisticians onto it and actually look at the published research and try to replicate it.
For me, I would ban all tobacco immediately. Yes. For you as a libertarian, you wouldn't accept that?
No, I wouldn't, and I would point you to the prohibition era in the United States for alcohol. A lot of people think that prohibition was a complete failure as a policy. In actual fact, to the contrary, prohibition of alcohol in the United States was very successful. A lot of people started drinking a lot less alcohol. Church attendance went up. So many people would say, yeah, let's do that. But in actual fact, everybody thinks it was a failure because of the social costs. It empowered Al Capone and criminality and smuggling and all these things. And the prohibition costs are actually incurred long before prohibition occurs. So with excessively virulent anti-tobacco policy, we actually are now incurring these prohibition costs.
And if I can't ban tobacco outright, I want to hurt the tobacco industry as much as possible from the outset. And I don't want them to have any brand credibility whatsoever. You as a libertarian are going to take a different view of that.
I'm going to take a different view of that because ultimately and fundamentally it is not business's fault that consumers make choices. So the fact of the matter is consumers prefer alcohol to milk, and they prefer detective stories to Shakespeare. And consumers more or less are sovereign in an economy. And if they want to engage in all sorts of vices, they will find somebody who will provide them with those vices. And it is always so much better to have a legitimate, properly regulated, legal company with shareholders that receive dividends, that pay taxes, providing people with the vices they desire.
So basically, if we want a tougher tobacco policy, stick to the facts, determine which policies are working, and pursue that which is effective and does the least social harm.
Yes.
Professor Sinclair Davidson, thank you.
Thank you.